This is the Human Action Podcast with your hosts, Jeff Deist and Dr. Bob Murphy.
Welcome back, everybody, to another Human Action Podcast, joined as always by my co-host, Dr. Bob Murphy. Bob, how are you?
I'm doing all right, Jeff. How are you doing?
Well, did you happen to catch Janet Yellen's apologia earlier this week about not understanding that inflation would be more persistent than she predicted?
Is there a risk of inflation? I think there's a small risk, and I think it's manageable. I don't anticipate that inflation is going to be a problem, but it is something that we're watching very carefully.
Was it a mistake, Madam Secretary, to downplay this inflation risk? Did that contribute to the problems we're all seeing right now?
Well, look, I think I was wrong then about the path that inflation would take. As I mentioned, there have been unanticipated and large shocks to the economy that have boosted energy and food prices and supply bottlenecks that have affected our economy badly that I at the time didn't fully understand.
It seemed apparently she misjudged. So it caught a lot of these experts by surprise.
Yeah, that's really something, the act of contrition. But of course, nobody gets fired in these cases. I always notice that. Nobody gets fired. They say, I was wrong. But
it's kind of like when Janet Reno took full responsibility for Waco,
yes.
If you remember, and nothing, she didn't even resign or nothing.
Yes, and I believe,
I'm glad you did that. That's big of you.
I believe she's a university president now in California, so she landed on her feet.
Yeah, it's good she bounced back from that.
Janet Reno. But I wanted to give our audience a bit of a crash course today in so-called stablecoins, and this is prompted by a couple things. Bob, I mentioned to you a couple days ago, I was reading Ben Bernanke's new book, which is called 21st Century Monetary Policy. And it really shouldn't be called that because only the very end of the book is future-facing at all. And he's really talking about the same old tools, QE, that sort of thing. He still has, as some of his critics in the Amazon reviews mention, he still has this zero-bound mentality. He doesn't understand the future. So reading that book, which I found boring and also self-serving on the part of Mr. Bernanke. But nonetheless, Caitlin Long, many of you know her name out in Wyoming. She is the founder of Custodia Bank. She, via Twitter, brought the world's attention to an interview recently with Manmohan Singh, who is an IMF economist. And this is a pretty lengthy interview on stablecoins and central bank digital currencies and collateral, and how all these things might work with the world's plumbing in terms of clearing transactions across borders between central banks, and how stablecoins might ultimately be co-opted or even end up on central bank balance sheets. So it was a very fascinating interview and very forward-looking in terms of the 21st century financial system, in contrast to Bernanke's, I would argue, backward-looking book. So that said, Bob, I know you've had a chance to read this interview with Mr. Singh. Where should we start? Maybe we should start with what the hell is a stablecoin?
Sure. Okay. So I think at this point, surely most of the listeners know what a cryptocurrency is, the prime example, of course, being Bitcoin. But the problem in that environment, for those who are interested in it, is that these cryptocurrencies were so volatile compared to whatever your own domestic currency was. And so, and people didn't want to have to keep switching in and out of crypto into more conventional assets. So the ostensible function of a so-called stablecoin was, these are supposed to be, digital coins or tokens, depending on what it was, that's similar to Bitcoin, that you could, get in and out of those things on the crypto exchanges. But it was supposed to have its value be stable in terms of some other asset. Now, in theory, the terminology is used somewhat liberally. So like you could have something linked to an ounce of gold, for example. But the way most people are using it, they mean it's linked to another government-issued fiat currency. So in particular, the US dollar. And so the idea being that, hey, if you wanted to go into cash but not actually get out of crypto, you could like sell your Bitcoin or your Ethereum or whatever you had and move it into some of these stable coins that were supposed to be pegged to the US dollar. And that way, once you made you could do profit taking or whatever if your losses got too big during a crash, and then you go to cash, in terms of like as if you got out of the stock market and went into a money market fund. So that's what economically these things were supposed to be doing. Two of the main ones were what's called Terra, or the abbreviation is UST, and then another one was Tether. And so there was a crisis that happened in early May, just real quickly. So Terra basically collapsed. Like if you look at a chart of its price, it was bouncing around $1 all the way up to early May, and then all of a sudden it just fell off a cliff. As of right now, I just checked before we started recording, Jeff, and it's trading at about 2 cents. And there's an official thing saying their blockchain has been officially suspended. Whereas Tether did drop. The chart I looked at, it got down to 98 cents, but I've seen other people say in intraday trading, it got down to as low as 95 cents for what's supposed to be $1, but then it since recovered. And the two main differences are Terra had an algorithmic protocol. So the idea was if it got below $1, it was supposed to automatically destroy units of itself to restrict the supply to get the price back up. So in theory, it was supposed to gravitate towards $1, and then on the other end, vice versa. If it was trading at above $1, the supply would automatically inflate. Whereas Tether was backed up by, ostensibly US dollar assets like commercial paper and stuff like that, and that was part of the issue. So I'll just wrap it up here. So a lot of people are saying, well, this is crazy. Of course, this crazy, wacky, algorithmic things, science fiction, a bunch of computer nerds doing something and blew up in their faces. This is bad news. But let me just mention, the theory was with Tether, which again weathered this storm much better, even though there were a lot of redemptions. The problem is that sort of mixing the two things. Like the whole point of cryptocurrency was supposed to be you don't need to trust some third party to do something, to keep it running. So with Tether, if the people who say, if you want to redeem this, we have US dollars and various other assets that we can use to give you, if they just renege, or as it turned out, if they weren't holding the assets in as liquid a form as people had originally thought, then you could be in trouble. And that kind of defeats the purpose. Whereas with Terra, programmed with this thing called Luna, it was all on autopilot. So the idea was everybody could just look at the code and know this is how the algorithm works. So if it had worked, you don't have to rely on human volition. But unfortunately, it didn't work. So that's kind of the crash course.
And also, in theory, a stable coin could simply be backed by a commodity itself, like gold, and that could reduce its volatility.
Right. Yeah. So, but again, though, when you think through, you get into the issue of the whole point and the sort of computational or cryptographic problem that Satoshi solved was how do we, use public and private key encryption in order to be able to transfer these bitcoins to other people without somebody being in charge of the network, either through malice or the government attacks them or whatever. And so again, if you say, oh well, I have these digital items that convey that, oh, there's some bank somewhere in Amsterdam that's holding this much gold on my behalf. Again, the problem is, well, if the authorities raid them, or what if they turn out to just be lying? So that's the issue. So again, but yes, you're right, Jeff. The way this term stablecoin is used, usually in context, it means a crypto thing that's tied to a fiat currency issued by a state, but it could also be a hard asset like gold.
But we have examples in history where a peg, in other words, a fixed exchange rate, which is the opposite of a market price. It was $1 was 1/35 of an ounce of gold. And that caused huge problems when you attempt to fix the value of something against, let's say, an underlying commodity, because as the underlying commodity has a mind of its own and goes up or down in value, that messes with your exchange ratio. So isn't the idea of having a pegged exchange rate for a so-called stablecoin, isn't that inherently problematic?
Well, it depends on how it works. So Murray Rothbard wrote a lot about that in terms, again, obviously not talking about cryptocurrency, but talking about like the classical gold standard. Because Milton Friedman had an essay where he was saying, hey, we should have flexible exchange rates for currencies just like we do for sugar or coffee exports, and you don't want government setting prices there. But Rothbard's point was, well, yeah, but under the classical gold standard, it wasn't that if you tried to trade dollars against gold outside the official range, they would put you in prison. It's just there was arbitrage opportunities set up, and you'd be stupid to do so. So it was a market price. Like you could buy and sell pounds for gold or dollars for gold or whatever you wanted as of 1912. And it's not that the authorities would punish you in any way. It was just because there was a standing offer on the table that, hey, if you give us this many British pounds, we'll give you this much gold. Or if you give us this many dollars, we'll give you this much gold. It would be silly for you to trade outside a certain range, taking into account shipping costs to move gold across the Atlantic. So that's the way Rothbard treated it. Was he saying it wasn't a price control in the now in some cases they do obviously have foreign exchange controls and things like that after Bretton Woods and things. So the more time passed and the institutional structures changed, then it was not just, hey, the government's saying we promise to give you this much gold if you turn in our issued currency. It got more so-called managed. But strictly speaking, with these stable coins, if it is just like Tether saying, if you want to redeem these things, we'll give you the requisite number of US dollars, that should provide a floor under the market price, but it's not that you're going to get penalized. And in fact, the price did dip below. So people were trading Tether at less than $1, even though in principle they were redeeming them like crazy, and people were getting paid off 100 cents to the dollar.
Well, if you go back to the original promise of Bitcoin and the original premise, if you read Satoshi's white paper and you read Saifedean and others, if a stable coin needs to be backed by another fiat currency or a commodity or even an algorithm that refers to something apart from itself, then I think you've lost some of the problem. It's not a true cryptocurrency in that sense, in the sense of the way Bitcoin was conceived to operate strictly based on its own hardness and its own fixed supply.
Right, exactly. And that's, I confess, when I first heard about stablecoins, that was my initial reaction. Like, well, doesn't this defeat the whole purpose? If you want something that maintains its value relative to the dollar, why don't you just own treasuries or a money market fund or something? Why are you in crypto? But again, the more I researched it, so I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I think part of it was just the transaction, that it was easier for people who are investing in crypto and have 60 different things in their portfolio of different coins and tokens, that if in case they did well in one and they wanted to sort of rebalance their portfolio and you wanted to go to cash, you didn't want to have to actually sell and then get US dollars and put it in a bank account somewhere, because that there's transaction costs and it's just cumbersome. It was easier just to keep it all in crypto. And so if one of them was pegged to the dollar, and again, that was the theory behind the protocol that governed the UST, that the Terra that was tied to Luna or that used Luna, was they were saying, it's not that we have US dollar assets somewhere and you redeem it, because then you'd have to trust us to follow through on that. Look, it's the algorithm automatically. If the price dips below, then we destroy this, and so that should raise the so that they were trying to address the problem you're saying, Jeff. But again, it didn't work in practice. That it just, if the selling pressure was too hard, the whole thing collapsed.
Now, seemingly related, but perhaps actually unrelated, is this idea of central bank digital currencies. So let's discuss that. I guess first, the idea of digital is not nearly as novel as we imagine. That's the defining aspect of a cryptocurrency. I mean, most of your existing checking account with your local bank is digital, right? You only have so much cash on you, but your balance is a lot higher than the physical cash you presumably have in your home or safe deposit box or whatever. So just the fact that something's digital isn't new in and of itself. So give us a quick definition. What is a central bank digital currency, and what's the point of a central bank creating one, which hasn't happened in the West yet, but appears to be further advanced in China?
Sure. So you're exactly right, Jeff, that we need to be careful. A lot of people, because they think, cryptocurrency like Bitcoin is digital money, there's no physical pieces of paper or anything else tangible that you turn over to a merchant to get your stuff. It's all electronic. You use it, it's computer money. That there's a tendency to think, so the central banks, and that's partly their marketing, and they call it like Fed coin and stuff like that. That it's, I think they're trying to co-opt the enthusiasm for the advantages of Bitcoin and then use it, to get people to still use state issued money. And so you're right that, Jeff, in principle, people know what digital currency is. It's when you just use your debit card. So we could move to a cashless society, without fundamentally changing anything. It would just be, instead of you ever using a $20 bill to pay for something, you just always pull out your bank card, or you know, if you get a chip embedded in your wrist or something and you have that be scanned. But so it's just an electronic ledger somewhere, and some institution is saying, oh, we're debiting your account by this much and crediting the merchant or whatever. And so there's nothing newfangled about that. It's just a matter of extreme. So, but what the central bank digital currencies are, it's yes, that they're going to just directly issue this thing, and then everybody trades with it. And so they can use, you know, elements of like a blockchain type approach if they want to. You know, the things can be a ledger, but the point being, though, the way a transfer will work, like if you want to sell a car to somebody and they want to pay you in terms of this currency, with Bitcoin right now, what happens is the buyer, you know, uses his private key in order to publicly sign off on the transaction, and then the way it works, you know, the rest of the world, anybody who cares, can verify that, oh yes, only the person with the private key could have produced this result. And so we believe you that you were the rightful owner of those Bitcoins, and then you transfer them over and this guy can give you the car. But with the central bank ones, it's not it's a decentralized distributed process where people around the world can verify the authenticity of the transaction. It's the central bank on its end maintains a record of how many US dollars or whatever, you know, how many Fed coins does each account hold. And so if you want to buy something, then we're the ones that are final arbiters as to say whether that transaction is valid or not. So they're ultimately maintaining control. That it's not a trustless network. It relies on a third party, namely, you know, the Federal Reserve or the U.S. Treasury or whoever the authority figure is in this case. So I think it's a way to sort of tell, you know, they can see the public is becoming enamored with crypto, and so it's a way, I think, to co-opt that and to say, oh yeah, well, this has all the advantages of Bitcoin. You don't have to worry about messy paper dollars and stuff like that. It's just as easy and convenient, and we don't have to worry about drug trafficking, and if we need to worry about tax compliance. So this way you're legal and stuff. And you don't look what happens in this wild west of the crypto market. People get defrauded all the time. There's all kinds of crashes and stuff. You know, you can trust this. It's got the safety and security of the US dollar and the advantages of Bitcoin. That's the way it's being marketed.
Yeah. And the whole payment systems thing on the retail end for the average individual was already awesome before cryptos. I mean, you go travel abroad, you swipe your Visa, and you walk out of the cafe. I mean, it was pretty seamless. I mean, not in terms of privacy, but otherwise, you know, and even they might ding you a percentage point or two because you're abroad and there's a Forex trade there or something. I mean, who cares? But Mr. Singh,
if I could just jump in, Jeff, even there too, though, I don't know how others feel, but there's a sort of comfort to know that, whereas like if you were paying with actual currency, you know, you're sitting at some foreign restaurant and the menu is quoted in their local currency, and then you say, oh, wait a minute, I just have, you know, $20 US bills on me. You're worried they're going to give you a ridiculous exchange rate. Right. Whereas if you swipe your Visa card, you know, oh, Visa's not going to let them charge them a ridiculous exchange rate. So there's a sort of security that, you know, oh, I got this big international company on my side.
Bob, that's a very xenophobic comment. Are you accusing Turkish shopkeepers of overcharging gullible Americans when they buy rugs?
Whatever the market will bear. That's economics.
So interestingly, Mr. Singh gives us, I think, a very important point that a central bank digital currency, in terms of how we conceptualize it or account for it on, in our case, the Fed's balance sheet, is very simple. It is just part of the monetary base. It's M0. We already think of M0 base money as all the currency, physical currency in circulation, plus commercial bank reserves at the Fed. So a central bank digital currency would just increase, if it increased, rather than supplant physical currency, that would just increase M0. And so that's a good way, I think, to completely get out of this digital mindset that there's nothing crypto-ish about a central bank digital currency.
Right. Yeah. I think it's okay to think about it. Tell me if you disagree, that it's almost as if each individual is allowed to have an account with the Fed, the way the commercial banks do right now. And you know, maybe that's one way of thinking about it. And so, yeah, there's nothing about, like you say, public-private key encryption, and certainly it's not that to verify the validity of a transaction, it's a decentralized system with no, you know, center choke point. That, you know, that it's not that at all. And also too, just to go back to the control they have. So that's why if somebody is doing something U.S. officials don't like, they can just shut off your money. They could just shut off your access to that. And so if we've moved to a point where there's no more physical cash and all transactions are done with the central bank issued digital currency, and they shut you off, you're dead in the water.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be a trial or anything. Just like we talked about in earlier episodes, Jeff, with freezing the assets of these Russian oligarchs. Whatever you think about their behavior, it's kind of scary if they can just be shut off from international trade without, a trial.
Yeah, you don't need to be debanked by Wells Fargo. You just be debanked by the Fed itself. And of course, in the Scandinavian countries in particular, they've almost achieved a cashless society, at least for the non-black market. And if people pay with their phone, whatever it might be. But I want to talk about a related issue, which comes up at a couple points in this really fascinating interview. We'll link to it. The interview is a bit jargony. There are some complex topics, and that jargon and complexity alone makes me concerned about the future of the monetary system, simply because under the kind of system and plumbing which Mr. Singh envisions, I think average people would be awfully beholden to technocratic experts in a banking class to make all this happen every day. So that money should be simple. The global economy should be complex, but the money should be simple. I think that's something that we can agree on. But when you're talking about money and credit creation at the central bank level or at the fiscal authority level of a sovereign government, in our case, that's the U.S. Treasury, there's a feature called Seigniorage, which is basically the difference between what it costs to produce, let's say, a new $20 bill physically, the materials and labor, versus $20, which the Treasury then gets to spend or exchange with the central bank or with bondholders or whatever. So in a digital environment, presumably the cost to the issuing authority to produce new currency in circulation in digital form falls virtually to zero.
Right. Yeah. So it's you're exactly right, and you can think of it in terms of like old school, the Caesar or somebody debasing the currency, like where that term actually comes from is the tax revenue comes in, it's a form of gold coins, let's say, and then they melt them down and then strike a greater number of coins, and they mix in a baser metal. So the gold content of each coin is less than it used to be, and then they go and spend that. And so that's a sense in which, because of the legal authority to be able to stamp the thing and say, oh, this is still the same type of coin as it was before, and has the same legal tender status, like that's the way that, because they have that power, they can sort of benefit financially from it. And like you say, if the way it worked is the Treasury just had a $300 billion deficit and they just created $300 billion in $100 bills and went and spent that, then yeah, technically that's not free money. There's the paper has cost, the ink has cost, but that's very low. So that would be, but in the way the U.S. government runs its books right now, it's not that naked, right? Technically, the Fed creates the money out of thin air and lends it into existence, and the U.S. Treasury, ends up paying interest on it, and then the Fed just remits the difference. So it's not as naked as that, even though in underlying the mechanics, that element is still there with monetizing the debt. But you're right, in terms of just digital currency, that cost falls even more, that they don't even have to bother printing up the currency. And it's presumably easier to crack, well, depending on how the design is, it might be easier to restrict counterfeiting, because that's a problem too with just traditional money, is that counterfeiters can come in and they, in a sense, get some of the government's, hone in on its territory. They get some of the benefits of the inflation if they get away with it.
But as Mr. Singh points out, Seigniorage is a more important part of government operations in developing and less affluent countries. It matters more there, and they rely on this more in terms of their fiscal operations. And maybe as a result of that, they get, at least in the 20th century, we think of a lot of developing countries have worse or steadier inflation than we do in the West. And maybe that's because they're financing more of what their governments do through just this really naked seigniorage process.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right that the two, it's not two unrelated points. They go hand in hand to the extent that a smaller, government, a larger share of its revenue can be effectively attributed to the fact that, they're printing money and what they get to buy with it is less than what they had to use in real resources to print up the money. That tends to debase the currency, because then there's no, like, if you do it that way, again, if they just literally monetize the deficit and they say, we're short, we want to spend this much, our revenue's only this much from tax receipts, let's just print up the currency and buy it. There's no way to suck that back out, as opposed to if the central bank lends that new money into existence, technically when those loans are paid back, the money can be destroyed. And then they can just decide whether to do it again. But if the government's literally just running the printing press to cover its deficit, there's no way to suck those excess money units back out of existence. And so that's why the measured price inflation would tend to be higher in that sort of regime.
So now that the world is mostly digital, there's all this new fintech, financial technology, and all these new fintech companies which are attempting to compete with the more traditional ideas of what we consider banks or commercial banks or Fed member banks. And then you've got, the BlackRocks of the world in addition to this, which sort of straddles a couple of these categories. And of course, fintech firms are not generally under the same banking regulations. So Mr. Singh, among other things, is apparently an expert in shadow banking, which I know is something you've written quite a bit about, Bob. So it strikes me, based on this interview, that stable coins and their co-option maybe by central banks, or their introduction onto central bank balance sheets, separate and apart from digital currencies, central bank digital currencies, is a way to sort of get fintech wrestled to the ground, maybe as a threat to the powers that be, to bring it under the regulatory landscape, to bring it under Basel III requirements, et cetera, and that maybe those of us who favor private money ought to be worried that IMF economists like Mr. Singh are scheming about how to capture stablecoins.
Sure. So a recurring theme in that interview is they kept talking about so-called siloing treasuries. And the idea was, if, something like Tether, if the point of Tether is to say, for the outstanding Tether coins that people can turn them in, or I guess they'd be tokens technically, and then we have a bunch of very safe, liquid US dollar denominated assets, things like commercial paper, but even better yet, short-term treasuries. So you can be sure if you want to redeem this stuff, we'll give it to you dollar for dollar. And we literally have the dollars, right? So their concern was, or the issue is, if Tether takes off and as that market grows, and up till now they were saying the stablecoin market's like under 200 billion, but if it keeps growing, then in order for the stablecoins, at least the ones that are backed by other assets, now all these treasuries are getting reserved or gobbled up by these stablecoin issuers to be able to back up what they're doing. And so now the treasuries aren't available to the more traditional investment banks and things who need treasuries, as part of their regulatory, Basel requirements or what have you, just to show we've got safe liquid assets backing up what we're doing. And so then when there's a crisis, right, they can come in, and the so-called thing of shadow banking is to say, hey, somebody like JP Morgan or whatever, they fall under all sorts of regulations to protect the consumer, so that people who think my money is safe, particularly if it's literally a depository institution, that, the person taking my money and deposit and saying I have this available to me, there's all kinds of regulations they have to satisfy. Whereas if I give $1,000 in US currency to buy 1,000 units of Tether, and I think, they're promising me that's going to be there for me, and they're going out and buying treasuries to back it up, there's not as many regulations on what they're doing. And so if you're the kind of person that think regulations are necessary, well, then that's going to look like a gaping hole. And it's going to look like, there's all kinds of stuff going on there. And so we need to plug that hole. So yeah, that's the angle that they're coming through, and that they will try to regulate this, and they can cite, this recent panic and it was a run on the bank, that sort of thing.
Well, it's interesting that Mr. Singh uses the term moneyness. He's talking about under some of the banking regulations, and the overnight lending between banks, repo operations, all these things that I guess we would call plumbing. that have regulatory rules about how low your reserves or whatever, or your capital constraints can go. When he talks about moneyness, I mean, that's a very Hayekian concept, the idea that there could be degrees of moneyness. There could be better and worse money, I think is correct. There's no reason why there can't be, better and worse money. But it feels like we are losing control over our concept of money. In other words, we don't know how much money and credit is out there because as things like treasuries or even Goldman Sachs bonds begin to look more and more money-ish in terms of you can use them to collateralize all kinds of operations, then you get into much broader monetary measures like M4. People can look up that concept. And then you start to say, well, how much money is there on earth and how much debt and credit? And then how is it all collateralized? Is some of it being used by more than one party? That's what we call rehypothecation. It gets very, very scary, and it cries out for the clarity of either just, let's say straight gold or straight Bitcoin. In other words, forms of money that are completely outside of this whole system.
Sure. So just to make sure that people at home get the basic issue. So use a real simple example. In other words, they might say, well, what is it with this M0, M1? Isn't money? So, it has to do with the relative degrees of it. So let's just use the U.S. as an example. So everybody can agree, a $20 bill that's correct, that's not counterfeit, that's legally issued, is legal money. That's clearly part of the money supply. When you say how many dollars are in existence, clearly $20 bills have to be in that number. And again, putting aside whether it's good money or not, but clearly that's money. Okay, but now you say, well, what if I put the $20 on deposit in my Bank of America checking account? And so if I go to the ATM and put my card in and say, what's my balance? And now it's showing $20. Should that be part of the money supply? And it's not as obvious because Bank of America didn't take the $20 bill and just put it in a vault that it's saving for me, right? They might have lent some of it out effectively. And so when you realize that, you say, and that's why bank runs are possible. And so if you include checking account balances as part of the money supply, that number can be bigger than just the physical currency. Because again, if people deposit their money and then the bank lends out some of it, now the community as a whole thinks they have more money at the bank than the bank has physical currency, right? And so that's why you get in this issue that the government or central bank can't actually control some of these broader. And so, by the way, the M1 would include checking account balances, whereas M0 doesn't. And then you say the next level, okay, what about a retail money market fund, right? There's a sense in which that's pretty liquid, and you can see why that's closer to money. That's more like a $20 bill than if you say, I have $20 in my home value. That's not the same thing. Or I have $20 worth of stock. That's clearly not money the same way that, if I have $20 in my money market retail account, retail money market fund, that seems like it's more dependable, right? So that's the issue of degrees of moneyness, and these broader M, 2, 3, 4 include things that are further away from a literal $20 bill. And so what happens is, when there's a financial panic, people try to get out of the stuff that's less liquid and into the more liquid things, the more dependable. And so some of these broader aggregates can collapse. And so that's part of the issue, and that's why you have like deflationary pressures, even if the authority. So that's what happened. Just one last point I'll make here, Jeff. That's what happened in the early 30s, and why Milton Friedman was saying, the money supply collapsed by a third. So people who've read his commentary, they might think, wow, was the Fed officials, were they just drunk? Why would they do that? It's not that the Fed destroyed money; it's that people were taking their money out of the banks, and so by the mechanism I just said, that actually shrunk M1 or M2 because checking account balances were part of that. So it's not that the Fed was literally destroying money. Actually, they had the loosest policy up to, in history up to that point in the early 30s. It's just what the public was doing was more than offsetting it. So that's the kind of stuff that Singh is talking about. And the same treasury, if it's used by one firm as collateral, and then it issues something, and then some other firm that's less regulated uses what that firm issued as collateral itself, you can have this chain of rehypothecation. And so a bunch of people are walking around thinking they have liquid funds available if they need it, But if one element in that goes away, the whole thing collapses. And that's partly what happens with these financial contagions. And that gives the ostensible rationale for regulation to say, oh, that's why we got to make sure, the Wild West free market isn't just building a pyramid scheme.
If you like Bitcoin, I think you would not want to be within 1,000 feet of any of this stuff. I mean, it's just an absolute camel's nose under the tent. Let me just quote him, Mr. Singh, a little bit, talking about we have to have broader measures than traditional money assets like M1 and M treasuries themselves. When you want to think about a proper measure of money, you've got to include anything that has liquidity or transaction services. So transactions are the plumbing, for example, repo. So even 20-year treasury has some liquidity in it. That's interesting. Maybe less so than a 3-month treasury, but there's something to it. So there's really a broad sense of what money is. And I guess the question then becomes, what do these guys want? I mean, what does the IMF want? Why would they want to get involved with stable coins? What would even this mean for their balance sheets? For example, Mr. Singh predicts that the Fed is going to unwind its balance sheet from 9 trillion to about 6 in a relatively short order. It sounds like he's saying maybe just a year or two. I'd love to revisit that in a year or two and see if that's true, if it actually goes the other way. But where do stable coins fit into this at all? What do central bankers want?
Okay, so, and again, I don't know this guy personally, and with all these things too, it's, as you can guess, Jeff, like I'm very cynical and think that institutionally, places like the IMF or the World Bank or the U.S. Treasury, they're going to come in and do things that are ultimately harmful and that enhance their own control. That doesn't mean any particular academic who's on their payroll and who's writing papers and whatever. It could be the kind of thing that the reason they got hired by the institution is because the stuff they genuinely, sincerely believe helps, those more nefarious motives. So I'm not casting stones on this guy personally, but right. I think big picture, what's happening is that they, to the extent that Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies did provide an escape valve, a way for people to transact outside of this nexus of government-controlled money, and it would be an embarrassment too, just like Uber and Lyft sort of are an embarrassment to the traditional medallion taxi cab industry. That likewise, if Bitcoin takes off and the world just the adoption rates keep increasing, then that kind of shows, hey, we don't need a state to issue money. And so I think that they really needed to nip that in the bud if they could. And that's, partly why they're trying to co-opt it now, is because they realize, so-called digital cash is here to stay and we got to just have our own version. So with the stablecoin stuff too, because that's relatively unregulated, then people can more, go in and out of that more easily without having to go through these firms that have to satisfy all these financial regs. So a lot of it's easier. You can move in and out of this stuff. And if you want to, quote, go to cash, just go ahead and get a stable coin if you were convinced that it was going to be stable, instead of getting into things that are more tightly regulated. And so if you're a regulator, and if you generally believe in the principle that, you got to have some guardrails in place, you just can't have crazy anarchy, then that looks like it's this gaping hole that's just going to, as that gets bigger and there's periodic crashes, that's going to defeat the purpose of having so-called safe assets. And so that's why they don't like it. Whereas, again, I think their higher ups like academics talking about that because they want to regulate everything. They don't want there to be an escape hatch.
Well, and he keeps using the term reg perimeter, meaning regulatory perimeter. He wants to draw stable coins into them. He wants less shadow banking, for example, in the system. Right. He wants more FinTech companies under the umbrella of these regulations. And I think we can understand why. There's just a tremendous amount of hubris behind, I think, this kind of interview, in the sense that no one's even considering whether someone needs to be in charge of all this and whether it ought to be really smart people at the IMF, which undoubtedly this gentleman is. But the hubris of just sort of treating all that as assumed and saying, not only do we know best, but we're absolutely necessary, that the world can't function without us. The world is too complex for money and payment settlements across, let's say, international borders to figure themselves out without our help. And that's what sort of, I guess, is one of the big takeaways from this. And if we want to think about the Wild West in cryptocurrency, I mean, imagine something as regulated as the securities environment for a publicly traded company in the United States. Okay, that's about as regulated as you get in the West. And yet, Bob, I guess it was, I want to say 2013, Dole Foods, we think of Dole Pineapple. Dole Foods had that huge scandal where, some investors wanted to take it private. If I recall, at 13 something dollars a share. And it turns out that there were something like 33% more outstanding shares than anyone at Dole knew of when they created this bid to take it private. So they were thinking $13.50 a share, and we're going to have to buy X shares from the public. This was a publicly held corporation, but in turns it was X plus a third. And everyone was like, how can this possibly be? Well, it turns out even under the regulatory environment, there's the Depository Trust Corporation at the top, which actually owns your shares in Dole. Then there's an intermediary bank or brokerage in between you, and then you, Mr. Investor in your 401k or your Vanguard fund or whatever, you're down here at the bottom. You're the beneficial owner. But I mean, nobody ever points to this and says, oh my gosh, what a disaster for the regulatory regime. They ought to hang it up. No, we say, well, we got to double down. We need a stronger SEC. So it's I guess I don't like this sort of presumptuous, everybody knows we're necessary tone to this interview.
Right. There's that element, and especially in light of you saying earlier how Janet Yellen was, oh yeah, I totally missed the boat on inflation. That it's not, even if you thought these people had our best interest at heart, and maybe some of them do, what if they're just wrong? And so that's partly why you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket and let this small group of elites run the global currency regime. Because again, what if they screw up? Even putting aside whether they mean to help people or not. I should probably mention before we run out of time here that part of the issue with this stuff has to do with maturity mismatching. So with all of this stuff, the potential problem is, and even like with Tether, where they got into trouble because some documents came out. I think it might have been the New York State Attorney General, but where the assets they were holding were not as liquid as investors originally thought. So it was more like they had things like commercial paper, and that's sort of as opposed to like literal checking account balances somewhere where someone says, hey, I want to redeem, I have 87 Tether, give me $87. And oh yeah, we have it over here in, FDIC insured bank account. That if instead they had commercial paper, that in a context of a run, if they're selling that heavily, then maybe it's a fire sale and the price drops. And that's what happens. So the fundamental problem there is maturity mismatch, where you've got effectively demand deposits, but the assets that are, quote, backing them up are of longer maturity. And so why would the institution do that? Well, if they earn a higher yield, that's how they make their money. And so fractional reserve banking that Austrians tend to focus on, that's just one example of this broader thing. And Walter Block and William Barnett actually had a paper. I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but it was interesting where they came out against maturity mismatching per se. So they were saying it's not just fractional reserve banking, it's this broader issue that's the problem. And they were arguing in a libertarian world, actually the court system and just the culture would limit that more. That they were arguing that that's really the issue here, and why we always get into these recurring problems. And like you're saying, Jeff, why do we assume government regulators coming in are going to fix this problem if it is a problem?
Well, to wrap up, there are, if I recall, a couple of sections in your book, Understanding Money Mechanics, which may be germane to our conversation today. I know there's a section on shadow banking. There's a section on Bitcoin. Is there anything I'm forgetting from your book in terms of the future, the plumbing of a complex 21st century money system?
Sure. Yeah. I know I got into the Basel Accords and like the difference between reserve requirements and capital requirements. So that stuff is all kind of related. Okay. And I think, I think that stuff is all under the shadow banking chapter. And right, there is a chapter on Bitcoin that, if people don't know what the mechanics are, that's where you could start.
All right, everybody. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank Dr. Murphy for joining us, and we'll be back with the show next week. Have a great weekend.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. And in the meantime, you can find more content like this at Mises.org.